because he knows that this is wrong because she's human and he's a monster in his own words. So you have this sort of thing where he's getting too close to her and then he backs off and then he goes back again, and you have Edward versus himself, and you also have Bella versus Edward, because Edward will back off and Bella will keep going. And then in the final act you have Bella being hunted by another vampire specifically because of her and Edward's relationship. This is where most people think the actual plot starts, even though it's just a very external conflict. This is Bella versus James, who is this other vampire. So you have the internal conflict, which is Bella versus herself, and then you have Edward versus himself, and then you have two different external conflicts, which is Bella versus Edward and Bella versus James. This is paranormal romance or supernatural romance. It's not, it's not fantasy. It's not war fiction. You don't have to have outright fighting to have a plot. Like, the plot progresses through conflict, and there's conflict all the way through. Everything is interlinked. Edward acts really to her, so Bella investigates. Bella finds out that Edward's a vampire, and she decides to go for him anyway. And Edward's like, well, who am I to stop you? And then halfway through the middle act, he's like, ooh. Along with this, you also have plenty of subplots. So a subplot is something that's not important to the main plot, but still continues throughout the length of the novel. So you have Bella adjusting to her new town. You have Jacob Black and his father trying to keep Bella away from the Cullens, and that is a subplot that continues through different books. And then you have Bella trying to mend her relationship with her father, which continues through the series as well. And then you also have the sort of overarching series plot of, like, the sort of comes in quite subtly at first, which is that Bella is in love with a vampire. He's not going to age and she's going to keep getting older, and that is something that comes up, I think, predominantly in Eclipse, but also sort of starts appearing in New Moon. Talking of Eclipse, the plot really kind of degrades in Eclipse, because you have the first and second acts consisting of competition between Edward and Jacob for Bella, and in my opinion this is very overdrawn. The love triangle was very, very pushed, not in a good way. And in Eclipse the antagonist is Victoria, who is introduced in Twilight, the first book. She could have been used so much better than she was, because she wasn't even brought in until one of the final scenes where she was confirmed to actually be the antagonist, and I just think there was so much more you could have done with that. So when people say that Twilight doesn't have a plot, I'm not really inclined to agree with them. Breaking Dawn does have a plot. Breaking Dawn has quite a strong plot that is there through the entire thing. It's not like Eclipse where they sort of wander about for the first. I mean, Eclipse isn't that bad. They do have like hints towards the end, but there's nothing really pushing them. There's no. The only sort of conflict is between Edward and Jacob, which sort of culminates in its own thing. It doesn't really culminate in the fight with Victoria. It sort of culminates in this sort of tent where Jacob's spooning Bella to keep her warm, and Edward's whining about it because he's upset because he's made of ice. I don't know what else he expected. So you do have this conflict, but it doesn't lead to anywhere. It's sort of a bit what's the word? PC? It's a bit PC. So another main criticism that I see often is characterization. So the emphasis is placed on Edward in the first book because the story is in first person told from Bella's viewpoint. That's why Edward seems more developed than Bella. But Bella is developed, this is the thing. But because it's told through Bella's perspective, you don't notice as much. Because Edward is the focus of Bella's attention, all of her attention and most of the prose focuses on him. He outright lies to Bella at points and she doesn't know his motivation, and that's why he can come across as his characterization can come across as a bit sort of conflicting and contradicting. But this is because when you have a first person narration, the narration is automatically biased. You might not be an unreliable narrator outright, but if the novel you're reading is told in first person, then it's automatically slightly more biased than a novel told in third person, which might be quite, all worldly. Because you're not having the events of the book filtered through someone's thoughts, if that makes sense. And then when she learns more about him, she does learn more contradictions, and the information that she knows about him changes. Bella's characterization also sort of degrades throughout the series. In the beginning, she's quite funny. There are parts in the prose where she's quite funny and she's quite hilarious. She has skills. She can cook, she can read, she can drive. I consider that a skill because I can't drive. You know, she goes hiking, she has things that she enjoys doing. She's also determined and she's curious because she sees there's something slightly off about Edward and she's like, well, I'm going to find out. And I don't care what stops me. And towards the ending, I think one of the problems with Breaking Dawn is because Breaking Dawn is split into 3 sections. It's split into Human Bella's narration, Jacob's narration, and then Vampire Bella's narration. And I think partially because you see a lot of Human Bella through Jacob's eyes, there's only 7 chapters of Human Bella in the beginning. You really you don't get a lot of Human Bella through because at that point her character, from Eclipse onward, she sort of stops being like a regular person and she starts becoming obsessed with having sex with Edward for some reason. I mean, fine, but you can be obsessed with that and also have like other aspects of your personality still present. So the beginning of Breaking Dawn is just that, and then I think when you compare it to the end, to Vampire Bella, Human Bella comes across as very bland and very boring. Midnight Sun was very good in that it didn't focus so much on Bella, but it did allow for better characterization of the Cullens, because I would say that if there is any one major flaw in any of these books, it is that the side characters are way more interesting than the main characters. I want a whole book about Rosalie. That's it. That's all I want. It's a whole book about Rosalie. And in the main series, the Cullens don't get the attention that they deserve. They're fascinating characters and they're not used. All they're used is like props and like problem solvers for Edward and Bella. Whereas Midnight Sun, they get personalities, they get backstories. It's so much better. So, narration. There are 3 narrators over this series, even though it's always in first person. So you have 3 different voices. You have Bella, you have Jacob, and in Midnight Sun you have Edward. All of these narrators have their own voice. They all have their own distinct personalities. Bella's purple prose, I hear complained about a lot, but this is because I think it's because she reads a lot of classic literature, because that is brought up a lot. That is brought up a lot in the first couple of books, where she'll be reading like Jane Eyre or whatever, Wuthering Heights, or Romeo and Juliet, wherever they are. And I think this comes across in her descriptions. Edward has this like a similar kind of narrative voice, and I think that's it's a really nice touch to have the 2 of them being quite similar, so they go together well. And I think the reason for Edward is probably because he is also well read, but also he grew up in the early 1900s, and that is sort of how they would speak then, which makes sense and it's good. I like it. It's consistent. And then you have Jacob, and Jacob's prose is fairly straightforward and more crude, which is a nice change, first of all, but also it's very it's quite reassuring, maybe a way in that the reader can relate a wee bit more. And I think having Jacob's narration in the middle of Breaking Dawn, when Bella is breaking down and becoming less and less human as she's pregnant with Renesmee, which we will get to in a minute, I think that was a very good choice, because I think if you'd had Bella's narration the entire way through, her breakdown and then transformation into a vampire wouldn't have had the same effect, because you see her degrading through someone else's eyes. So now we talk about flaws. So flaws of Twilight, everything has flaws. There are many flaws. Excessive descriptions. Bella and Edward's purple prose is one of the things that comes to mind. These are really bad examples of romantic behaviour that you don't really want to be distilling to tween girls, but I think the age range it was probably targeted to is probably like higher than that. It did start a wee avalanche of similar books where people were stalking her, which kind of culminated in 50 Shades of Grey, which isn't ideal. But I mean, that's not Twilight's fault. At the time it was fine. It's supernatural romance. What else did you expect? Other flaws, Renesmee, just not saying anything else. In terms of the series as a whole, a lot of people think New Moon is the most flawed book of the series, and they would be wrong, which I shall explain in a minute. So, New Moon, when I read the second time, I was like, what the hell's the point of this? It's so boring. Oh my god. Why is this even here? You could just skip it. You can't. It's very important that you can't, because it actually does a lot for characterization. This time when I read it, I was like, this is actually really good. How did I doubt this before? It's not. I mean, it's a 3-star book. It's second book in a series. It's going to be a 3-star. I mean, I don't think there's any second book that I've read in a series that's higher than 3. It's one of the books that divides people. It stands out from the rest of them because it's written in a slightly different way. So, Twilight in the beginning is very much like New Moon, but as soon as Bella realizes what Edward is, and they start dating, that's when this sort of structure that's seen in New Moon sort of breaks down a bit. So, for most of Twilight and Eclipse and Breaking Dawn, you have sort of secondary characters and Edward that's pushing the plot. Because the latter half of Twilight and most of Eclipse and most of Breaking Dawn, you have vampires trying to protect Bella, and they're the ones that are creating the conflict. They're the ones that are fighting with other vampires, and Bella's just sort of flowing along. But the beginning of Twilight and New Moon is different, because New Moon is driven solely by Bella and her decisions, for the first 2 acts at least. She's the one that decides to do things. She's the one that decides to push forward and do things. So none of her decisions come out of nowhere. This is the thing, is that a lot of people were like, when I read criticisms of this, a lot of people were like, well, she's doing things that don't make sense. Why would she do this? Bella is majorly depressed because she's codependent on Edward, and Edward leaves. Okay, here's the plot of New Moon, just really briefly, because it's important to this discussion. Bella, on her 18th birthday? I think it's her 18th birthday. On her 18th birthday, Bella goes over to the Cullens' house for a little party, and while she's there, she gets a paper cut while opening a present, and Jasper goes a bit mental. Jasper is one of Edward's kind of siblings, not really siblings. Jasper, who has been sort of vegetarian vampire, because the Cullens don't drink blood. I don't know if you knew that or not. It's not like it's mentioned every 4 minutes. Jasper, who's been vegetarian for the longest, smells her human blood, and he goes a bit mental and he tries to attack her, and Edward pushes her out of the way, and she falls into a decorative glass bowl, which of course you would have, and it shatters and it cuts all the way up her arm. Obviously Edward takes this as a sign that he's no good for her, he's dangerous for her, she can't be around vampires because she's too clumsy, and he decides to leave her, and he tells her that he doesn't love her anymore, and then he leaves. He just leaves, and she falls into a deep depression for about 4 months, and then after one night she goes out with one of her high school friends, and they go to a movie, and when they come out of the movie, there's a bunch of guys standing outside a bar, and she thinks she recognises one of them, and she goes to approach them, and she hears Edward's voice in her head, and every single time following that she is reckless or in danger, she hears his voice in her head, so she starts seeking out dangerous activities to do so she can hear him again. And this is partially because she is very codependent upon him, and it is partially because she isn't well. She's depressed. That's what you do. That's not what everybody does, but that is sometimes what you do. And this ends up, she finds a set of broken motorbikes, and she takes them to her dad's best friend's son, whose name is Jacob, and he's a mechanic, and she says, if you fix them, I'll give you one, and if you teach me how to ride them, then, you know, that would be even better. So he fixes them, and he teaches her how to ride them, and while she's on the motorbike, she starts to hear Edward's voice again, and then she's enjoying it so much she wants to keep doing it, and then Jacob disappears, and Jacob sort of won't see her anymore, and it turns out that Jacob is a werewolf and has a whole other subplot. And then she starts hanging out with werewolves, and then they start sending a vampire, which turns out to be Victoria. Surprise, even though she doesn't appear in this book in person. So while they're off trying to keep her safe, she's missing Edward, and she decides to go cliff jumping, which has previously been mentioned in the book. So she goes cliff diving and into the water, and for some strange reason, Alice, who is one of Edward's siblings, but not quite siblings. She can see the future, but she can't see these werewolves. So because Bella goes cliff diving and she gets caught up in a current, and then Jacob drives in and saves her, Alice only sees her diving in. She doesn't see her coming back out again, so she thinks Bella's died, and she mentions it in passing to Rosalie, who then tells Edward, and Edward decides to go and kill himself by personally offending the vampire overlords who live in Italy, which is a very sunny place for some reason. So then Alice appears, tell Bella what's happened, and they go to Italy and they drive and they save him. And then happily ever after, they live forever. So a lot of the things, my first point about this is that there absolutely no time is wasted in this book. The 4 months that Bella is depressed are expressed by 4 separate pages. I don't know if you can see this. So you have October, November, December, January, and then you have waking up. And that's all of Bella's depression. And in my opinion, that is a very good way to represent the passage of time and a depressed state without wasting too much time. And basically you pick up from there the day before, or a couple of hours before Bella and her high school friend Jessica go to the movies. So absolutely no time is wasted. It is one decision after another which leads the plot. There's not a lot of outright conflict in this book. It's mostly Bella versus herself, or Bella versus telling people that are telling her to not do the dangerous thing. Also, another complaint that I saw was that all of her decisions come out of nowhere. This isn't true. It basically goes, Bella thinks she recognises somebody and approaches him. Bella hears Edward's voice in her head. Bella wants to do more dangerous things. Bella sees motorbikes. Bella remembers her dad going, motorbikes are dangerous. She goes, I'm going to buy a motorbike. And then she previously knows that Jacob is a mechanic and takes her there, and every single thing goes like this. It is logically set up, logically for her mindset, it is logically set up that she should do these things. Jacob's also at his best in Newman. That's all I'm saying. It's before he gets jealous and petty and everything. So in summary, Twilight is not an amazing series, but it's not terrible either. All of the stereotypes that people condemn it for, the Mary Sue protagonist, the unhealthy romance, the perfect love interest, the love triangles, were not widespread when Twilight was first published, so they weren't problems. It's only looking back that you see them and you're like, well, that's a bit stereotypical. They weren't stereotypes at the time. I also disagree that Bella's a Mary Sue, but whole different video. Most of the hate from Twilight, I think, comes from the state of the films, because the films were horrendous. The films do nothing for the characters, and they change a lot of important scenes, and they just make the characters mostly unlikable. Robert Pattinson's, I mean, well done the cast for getting through that, man. The series does get worse as it goes on, but the first 2 books are still okay in my book. Pun not intended. Thank you very much for watching. That wraps this video up. If you'd like to follow me on Instagram and Twitter, my links will be posted down below. If you'd like to subscribe as well, if you'd like to hear more of this. I have plans for the rest of the series. If you have any other suggestions, let me know. I have a lot of books here that I need to read. If you'd like me to do a video on a particular book, then let me know. Also, my blog, I post book reviews on my blog every Monday. The link will be down below. If you have a book that is coming out shortly, or a book that you've published yourself, if you'd like me to review it, send me an email. A contact link will be on my blog, or leave me a comment and let me know, and I'll get in touch. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.